Hello, everyone. Welcome again. So in this video, I am with Michelle, who is a good friend and an astrologer. And Michelle is actually doing two videos for the symposium. This video talking about the polarities and another video talking about the goddess asteroids. So take a look on this video is on day 3 of the symposium, and then Michelle's next talk is tomorrow, the next day, day 4. So take a look at both. I'm going to read Michelle's bio so we get a refresher. So Michelle is a certified professional astrologer who sees astrology as a tool for healing and insight. Her research is in healing trauma, looking at relationships and family constellations in the birth chart for the purpose of healing and love. She is a mother and a student of A Course in Miracles. She practices meditation and intentional creativity while devoting her life to raising children, practicing partnership, and building community. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Martha. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. So we wanted to talk about the integration of the polarities, and one place we were talking about just before getting on, before recording, was that a great starting place is even the astrology of this symposium itself, which probably isn't a coincidence. So yeah, start where you would like.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all sense that the astrology of this particular time, whether you're an astrologer or not, right? The times that we're living in are intensified, and the intensification of those energies actually brings forward a lot of polarization. And so it seems really important to recognize like where that, and I felt it a lot more last year, especially as we were building up into this time. But wherever that existence of duality or polarity exists, there is a call for healing. There's your symposium title of like remembering the one is a perfect understanding of like what polarity is all about. So I'll share the chart with you right now, just so we can take a look at the beginning. This is the opening transits for the symposium, and we can even move through. But if we're looking at this in traditional astrology, the divine feminine is Venus and the divine masculine is Mars, right? These are great examples of where polarity has just been woven into our mythology, because the signs that Venus rules are Taurus and Libra, and they are the polar opposite of the signs in traditional astrology that Mars rules, Aries and Scorpio. And so we've placed on the zodiacal wheel this inherent polarization between the masculine and feminine. And a part of the calling right now is we have Saturn here in Aquarius squaring the nodes. And the nodes are ruled essentially by Venus and Pluto, Mars, depending on your astrological school of thought. But essentially, if we were to talk about the nodes being ruled by the divine masculine and the divine feminine, what our work is in Aquarius, what the deep inner work, the maturing and the development on a wide scale is the integration of these polarities. It's the integration of the feminine need for safety, for comfort, for beauty, for connection, and the masculine need for depth and intimacy. And that these aren't actually, from a gender perspective, these exist inside of all of us. We're all seeking love, safety, a sense of security and ground in our lives. We're all seeking a sense of connection and intimacy. And where these have been at war, I've talked about this in other videos that I've done, but I don't know if we talked about this in the goddess recording, but where the masculine and feminine energies have been at war relative to the patriarchy, relative to anywhere where we've allowed for a sense of separation, right? To define how we relate to the other. There's just a call for healing. And there's a deeper call for healing, especially right now. You have Mars and Chiron conjunct in Aries, literally the wounded masculine, the wounded healer was Chiron. And so we have Mars with the wounded healer. And what I love about the Chiron story is that while his wound was such a big part of who he was and his story, it was also what caused him to seek out and to make medicine and actually to become one of the greatest teachers. There's such a deep wound within the masculine that lives within each and every one of us, regardless of our gender or sexual preference, that basically says that it's not okay for men to be, or for the masculine energy to feel, to be, there's no safety in our vulnerability. We don't understand quite where the divide is between where the masculine becomes violent, right, and destructive, right? That would be Mars and Aries. That's like the call to war. But actually what the deeper healing of that is the courage to face that which is so deeply wounded within us. The courage to actually see the places where we've identified our will and our independence as something to be separate and something to be used against, or to protect us from others, to protect us from being hurt, right? And then we have the divine feminine with the North Node, with Pallas Athene, and with Uranus, which to me encourages a revolution of the feminine way of being, that our ground and our safety and that which brings us into that feminine nature of receptivity, of beauty, of pleasure, actually comes from a place of deep inherent wisdom, actually comes from a place of revolutionary change. And I was feeling this yesterday in terms of there are so many ways in which our needs and our longings and what we want can bring an air of disappointment, isolation, or a feeling of like, a lot of loneliness, a lot of these sort of deeper shadow aspects of the feminine needing to control, right? In order to have a ground of stability and feel relaxed and open and receptive, there's that element, Saturn, the Saturn element of like needing to control our environment, needing to control how things go. And that distortion takes us away from the truth of how our safety isn't necessarily found in the other, in the environment, in the way things are, but our safety is inherent in the divine, in the nature of our being. And so at this particular time, we have Mars in his own sign, and we have Venus in her own sign. There's a wholeness that both of these archetypal energies are presenting. And that wholeness means that in my own place, in my own sign, in my own being, I can come to do the work. What is my work to do? My work is to embody from a feminine perspective the inherent intelligence, that which we might even consider masculine intelligence. Pallas Athene here, the goddess who's with Venus, she was the daughter of Jupiter, right? And then she was considered to be born of Jupiter's head, born of his mind, not of a mother, right? It's such a unique thing to have a feminine archetype in the world. And what she could do, because she was born of the masculine mind, she could do things that were considered not okay for her gender in that time and space, right? She was free to be out in the wild. She knew how to hunt. And she just carried with her an inherent intelligence. And I see her presence in this time as like a reclaiming of the wild feminine, but from this place of deep discernment, deep and inherent intelligence that knows our being in a relative equality to the masculine. And so the Uranus element is that breaks up all the conditional roles and ways in which that we have operated in the past, right? Once we start really claiming our wholeness, we claim it in our sexuality. And if that doesn't fit the role or the normative culture, we claim it in our way of being, right? If that doesn't fit, then it sort of breaks apart the parts of the world that have said like, oh, that's what's okay. This is what's accepted. And we have to face judgment, shame, guilt. That's the Saturn piece. But when we truly do that, what happens is there's a natural liberation of energy, right? And both the feminine and the masculine polarities with the nodes in this Taurus Scorpio axis are calling for a liberation of these energies that will allow us to evolve. These are evolutionary changes that allow us to move out of traditional roles. We have also Pluto, who's in Capricorn at the very end of Capricorn, sort of finalizing this breakdown of the traditions, of the norms, of what do we consider mother, father, male, female, masculine, feminine. These things have held our souls in place in bodies that have been identified a certain way, in roles that have been conditionally normed as like, this is what you do. I saw a post from a woman recently, and she was in this post, noting like, oh, here I am. I'm divorced. I don't have children. I didn't do the XYZ that was labeled for the female success model, right? We get it. We get a husband, we get married, we have children. Like, if that's the only path to success as a woman, you're pretty doomed if you're half the population who are otherwise not choosing to have children, or not choosing to get married, or got married and got divorced and have blended families, or found themselves like deeply questioning their gender and sexuality and partnering with the same gender, or partnering or changing gender. Like, we have to break apart these roles, and part of the polarity, part of the healing of the polarity, is to recognize that the medicine is present in the other. The medicine is always present in what is going to bring us from strictly identifying with who and what we think we are, to being able to come from a place where we actually know our inherent wholeness. And I often think about that wholeness as being relative to a baby, because a baby comes out as a whole being. And there's a moment in time before that baby is assigned a name and is told that they are a particular gender. And then, and I've had this question in my mind, like, what would it be like to raise a child without identifying them as something? Because we're always identifying with what was the past, right? And in all of this astrology, we have these fixed signs. These are very concrete, crystallized ways of being, right? that have come over generations and generations that are being broken apart because from an evolutionary perspective, we are ready to actually claim ourselves as whole and complete. And thus, once we do that, you can't know yourself as whole and as unified, right? Possessing the divine masculine and the feminine inside, possessing all of creation on the inside. You can't know that without knowing that the other, any other person is exactly part of that and is one with that, is the same as that. And there's a reason from a creationary perspective, I feel that the two have to become one in order for one to be created. And then one is created from the two becoming one, it becomes whole onto itself. So the way we were created to be is whole unto ourselves and also requiring the other to create. And that cycle of evolution means that for all those labels, all those ways of being, all where we've othered the other, we actually have to dissolve that whole identity structure, which can be incredibly destabilizing, and come into a way of seeing ourselves both as that whole and as needing the other. And when we really truly acknowledge that like there isn't, I practice A Course in Miracles as my primary spiritual path, and it often refers very much to God, and then the brother, right? Everyone is your brother. It's a more masculine based language, but either way, it's basically saying everyone else is the one. And in that, you're in a holy relationship with everyone else. And until you realize that that holy partner, the person across from you, whether it's for me right now, it's Martha, whether it's your children, whether it's your family, whether it's the people that you work with, these are all holy assignments to essentially help us to remember, oh, we're just one. There's only one Son of God. That's the way it refers to it in the Course, one Son. But I would say there's only one extension of God that's existing in all these different forms. And the seeming polarity is often the polarization of the body. It's like I look and I see like, oh, there's Martha and she's in her own body. She's someone else. She has a different life. She has a different perspective than me, and we can often be also seeking from that same perspective, the one outside of us to fulfill that union, right? That for me has been a big part of my work and my longing and my facing the pieces inside of myself that come up in seeking the beloved, seeking the union, seeking that counterpart. And what happens when that is coming from a place that there's something missing inside of me, gone, like something not complete without it. And yet at the same time, there's a deeper healing in really, I've had to step back and learn how to really let go of all of the identified roles and desires and really question, like, where are these things coming from? Where does this feeling come from? And what is it that actually, and the more I've let go, the more I've felt the presence of that truth, like that this is both, I am totally whole and sovereign in my own being, and simultaneously this other person is an extension of the one that is inside of me. And we're no different in that way. It's the similar way that you can't hurt someone outside of you. You can't be angry or upset or have, strong feelings without that having an impact on both of you. Right. And that knowing that beginning to really integrate that into our lives, I think is part of this square that's happening throughout this year. This is not just, the symposium is a beautiful example of this particular moment in time where we're presencing all this work. Like, you brought forward so many incredible people talking about the divine masculine, and that there is a deep wounding in the divine masculine that is present in all of us. No one escapes that, regardless of gender or sexual preference or, any identification. No one escapes that wounding. And yet there is a very particular medicine that is being called forth as a part of the shift of where we are, that would bring about the end of war, that would bring about the end of the divide between the masculine and the feminine, simply by us claiming these particular pieces. And similarly in the feminine, there is a wholeness and there is a seeking of that fulfillment, right? That fulfilling connection with the other that only comes after we can fully rest in our own being and are no longer seeking for the divine outside of us. And that also resolves this other polarity that we can see from when you chose to start this symposium, the sun moon opposition here in Gemini, sun in Gemini, moon in Sagittarius, right? And the sun and the moon, the luminaries representing the father and the mother, right? And we have father mother ideas, ways of believing, thinking, that have become so polarized, right? And we can see that in religious institutions, we can see that in governments, we can see that those core ideas, they have to reach sort of a critical threshold where we realize, like, the Sagittarius question is, what is true? What is true with a capital T? This is the Jupiter work, right? We come to seek the truth, to seek to know ourselves. The more deeply we know ourselves, the more truth emerges. And I remember the first time I realized, like, oh my God, like people made this stuff up, like someone decided this was this and labeled it as such. And I've always held that to be true. But when you realize that there's a million other things that thing could be, even when you're in relationship to another person and you've always seen them the same way, Venus represents our perceptions in many ways. And we can walk through our lives with a very specific perception of others. And then all of a sudden, there can be a moment of grace where actually we begin to see people differently. And that comes, I think, from the inside, from our own shift to seeing ourselves differently, to being willing to see differently, to being willing to let go of stories that we've carried, things that we've held to be true. And that often feels like a crisis. It feels like, wow, this I thought my whole life, I was watching this documentary about a woman who had a sense that she had siblings. Her mother had fertility treatments so that she could be born. And she had a sense her whole life that she had siblings. And then she started to do DNA research and come to find out that the doctor who had been doing the fertility treatments had actually used his own specimen, and many children. She had, at this point, the documentary stated that she had 94 siblings.
Oh, wow.
Because of this particular doctor. And wow, it's like that right there created a massive crisis in consciousness. And what I see has happened as a result of that is that it propelled her towards discovering the truth about what was happening and asking these deep existential questions relative to this inner knowing that she had all her life, that she had siblings, but there's a breaking apart every time we find something new that's true within ourselves. And it's like every time she would discover a sibling, she would find something more about herself that she didn't recognize before. And I love to see what happens when the story reaches its point of forgiveness, because right now they're all in this place of being very angry and disturbed, and rightfully so. Like the wounds of all the injustices relative to that story are present. And this is kind of the time that we're in right now. While these polarities are so deeply triggered within us, while we're facing all these parts of our identity and our lives that are literally being broken apart because we're, as a collective soul, wanting so deeply to know the truth of ourselves. And that has to come through letting go of what's untrue, through, that's that's the Scorpio South Node. Like, can almost feel like a deep betrayal of existence, a dark night of the soul. And yet every time we go through that purification process, we come through to the other side being so much more clearly in touch with the way that we were created to be, and thus able to make the next evolutionary leap, and able to move forward in a way that opens our minds to new ideas. This would be the Gemini side of it. New ideas, new thoughts, new ways of thinking, right? New ways of perceiving reality that encompass a greater spectrum, that actually don't see polarities. Because if you think about polarities, if you're standing in the center, they're only on the periphery. You can't really see them. And if you're standing on one, you can only see the other if you're totally fixated upon it. But the entirety of the zodiac is encompassed in one wheel. Like the entirety of a soul's birth chart, your imprint, your natal chart encompasses everything. And as you start to study astrology, for those who are like more deeply interested in exploring this as a path for self-discovery, for learning, for transformation, you start to discover that everything is interconnected, right? You aren't your Leo sun with your, Pluto and Sag. You aren't your moon in Pisces. You are everything in that wheel, because the natal chart itself is capturing the sky at the moment of your birth, which has the totality of existence inside of it. And that's why it's such a beautiful medicine. It's like, from the totality of everything you came, and to that you return. And that's how we can know that all these parts exist within us. And we're simply in a process of ongoing integration that brings us closer to that awareness of like the two become one, and that becomes one, and that one is whole unto itself, and that one is connected to the two, and it's connected to the whole at all times. Like it's an inseparable like truth with a capital T, where it can exist outside of all these forms, that's the Capricorn piece. It's like we have all these constructs, we have all these forms that essentially limit our perception of what reality is.
Can I throw in something?
Yeah.
Two things that kind of go together. One is I'm also noticing that Mercury is at 0 degrees Gemini as this is beginning. So it's like we've got the polarities extra polarized, and then we have Gemini. We have Mercury also in its own sign at the very beginning of its Gemini sign, and kind of holding the place of the non-binary also, right?
Yeah.
And so what's clicking for me as you're talking is something I've been sitting with as I've been holding space for this symposium, which is this interesting contrast of within this whole conversation around gender and around polarity, there are people who are really focused on and who's, have major expertise in various aspects of the polarities, like in various aspects of the divine feminine or the divine masculine or some other version of that. And also there are a lot of people who are very focused on the non-binary realities and deconstructing even the idea of polarity, right? So I've been sitting with, how do I hold all of these needs and all of these realities at the same time? Because they are all completely legitimate from my perspective. And as you're talking, I'm getting it. I think at least one answer is, right, they're each a medicine, and each of us need a different medicine in a different moment. So I think what I've noticed is in a lot of the sort of younger generations, maybe 35 and under-ish, tend to be the people who are more focused on the non-binary, gender fluid kind of aspect of reality. That would include my 15-year-old, right? They identify as gender fluid. And anyway, it's and they have a very strong focus on the need to break down the construct of polarity. And then it seems like, especially maybe those of us kind of more in our 40s, 50s and up, there's a strong focus on the reemergence of the feminine and a healing of the masculine, which all of these things are so beautiful. And I appreciate all of them, right? And so I'm just seeing, even in the energetics of this chart, as this symposium is beginning, is there's all of that. Is the Mars in Aries with Chiron and even Jupiter in Aries coming up to that same point. And then, like you said, the Venus in Taurus on the North Node. But then you've got Pallas Athena sitting there, which is more of an androgynous energy. And then Mercury at 0 degrees of Gemini, right? So it's like, you've got the polarities and the non-binary, and they're all forms of medicine. Like they're all part of this work that we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can see, I mean, there's so much of Saturn is really in its own sign in Aquarius. Neptune is in its own sign in Pisces. Mars in its own sign in Aries. Venus in her own sign. Like there's a lot of where this particular point is really integration of those starting places within ourselves that would lead to the actual evolutionary shift, because there's an expansion that's being required of us, for those who haven't had relationship to someone who identifies as androgynous, or don't know what it feels like from a perspective to be a non-binary in their sexuality. And yet we have this evolutionary impulse that is also coming through a great deal of children at this time, and parents being called to support an opening of their minds to allow their children to bring forward a medicine that they're already born with, an awareness they're already born with. And that's going back to that piece I was talking about. What would it be like to give birth to a child and raise them without conditioning? Right? That's a deeper question of, before you were told who you are, who were you? Who am I? That root question, if we're all asking of ourselves, then it requires an opening of the mind. And Mercury in Gemini really can hold that duality, because it's like, yeah, everything can be true, right? And in fact, Aquarius, things that we hadn't imagined, future realities of, it's like we've adopted an entire language around gender and sexuality that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago, right? It wasn't a part of our culture. It wasn't accessible for people in the way that it is today. And there's still huge growth that needs to happen relative to where we actually can see ourselves as beings with an inclusiveness that begins to really dissolve those polarities. And I think that when we have polarities, Ari says something like this, like, whenever these polarities are really heightened, it's like the shadows of those things have to really come up.
Mm.
They get even more intense for a moment to be seen and then dissolved. And it's like we're in a final stage where it's like, as long as we're not repressing that which arises within us, and we're just actually giving space to see it, then it can dissolve as simply, as quickly as like the moon moves from being full back to being new again. Like we can move through a lot of these changes within our own being in a much faster, there's a faster pace, because we're being forced to shift what's on the fixed axis. And I that's a particularly limited amount of time. It'll be the next few months, really, through the end of this year, that the nodes are in Taurus and Scorpio, and then we move into the cardinal signs, which is Aries and Libra. And when we think about that, I just want to get, oh, here we are. We're getting to the end of this Taurus Scorpio axis. Pluto moves into Aquarius and begins preparing to square the nodes.
Wow.
So I think there's even deeper transformation to that collective consciousness that the younger generation is already advancing forward in so many ways, but that it will become on a more, mass scale that we are looking at integrating. And then Saturn moves into Pisces. It's like the whole dissolving of those things relative to our relationship to that core, like structure of our life. There's even more that's coming. So, and still, by the time the nodes are in Aries and Libra, they'll still be ruled by Venus and Mars. So I feel like this whole journey that we're on right now relative to, the divine feminine and masculine becoming one with one another, the end of the war between the genders, the end of really the war between the patriarchy and the matriarchy, and the emergence of a new culture and a new way of relating to one another is coming through this really deeply polarized state of being.
Yeah, I know we have to end. Just really quick, I'll say, I highly recommend everyone watch the video with Joe G, which talks about Mercury and the non-binary realities, also on the same day. And all of these videos are great on every day, but that one is such a great compliment. It's like, we need to just have that conversation all together. Yeah, and I'll just say something really quickly, which I say in that video also, which is, I talked to my 15-year-old, really, we've had lots of conversations around all of this. And I asked them at one point, why do you think your generation has this non-binary reality knowledge, wisdom coming up, and my generation didn't? And they said, well, I know for myself, I don't have a sense inside myself of the feminine and the masculine being at war. But you do. I was like, what? How did that happen? Yeah. And that's a way longer conversation. And again, and like I said in the other video, I'm divorced from the father of my children, right? So I would think that my child would somehow have some sense of there being the feminine and the masculine somehow in conflict or something. I mean, not that we've had any kind of really contentious anything going on, but that anyway, that shocked me and amazed me on so many levels that they would say that. And yeah, so I'm curious to just watch how this all unfolds, and the transits you brought up for the next couple of years. I hadn't looked at that before. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. It's like this is clearly not the end at all. It's part of a big story. Yeah.
Well, I'm a short time away from giving birth to my third child, and what I'm aware of is that each being comes in with a very particular medicine, and also that each generation comes in with a evolutionary leap built into their whole soul and being.
Mm.
And the more we are cultivating ourselves to be aware that that evolutionary leap exists inside of us, or inside of our children, or inside of our partners, like, and really nourishing that and caring for and protecting that so that it can grow, like, the more powerful the shifts are, and how we bring that forward into the world, in our own way, is our, like, that's our work to do. And I really feel that calling, and I honor the beings that are choosing to come into the planet at this time. It's a really incredible thing. So
Yeah, wonderful. Great.
thank
So
you.
before we end, we just remind people where they can find you and anything you want to say about what you're offering.
Absolutely.
Go for it.
I know I have a free gift on the symposium, so there'll be details on the website for that. You can find me at astrologywithmichelle.com, and I'm also the founder of the Goddess Astrology Collective, which is where I teach and bring forward things mostly on the asteroid goddesses, Venus, Juno. You can listen to the video that I did with Martha on that. Yeah, and I'm just absolutely happy to be of service to the soul growth and the work that we're all here to do on this planet. And thank you so much for having me a part of this amazing symposium.
Thank you. And more to come, I'm sure. With you, with me, with you and me, with all of this. It's, yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle.